With the savage opening salvos of the invasion as it unfolded in the Battle of the DFW metro area, the rapidly moving air assault forces were amongst the first on the scene as they arrived in downtown Fort Worth, downtown Dallas, and of course, the Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, which was a major key objective along with the downtowns of both Dallas and Fort Worth for use in the occupation following success in the nationwide invasion within this particular metro area, as these rapidly moving air assault troops from the 83rd Active Duty Air Assault Brigade of the PLA's Active Duty 83rd Group Army, which had been attached to the 59th, were moving in and hurriedly seizing their objectives. They were suddenly joined by enormous armored forces, including 3 attacking armored battalions from the 59th Reserve Group Army's 35th Armored Brigade, which suddenly and rapidly descended upon the DFW International Airport and assisted in its capture and the destruction of the locally defending forces thereupon. As all of this was taking place, as it pertained to the air assault forces, the many maneuver battalions belonging to different parent units within the 59th PLA Group Army were also likewise on the move, including armored forces from the PLA's 16th Infantry Division of the 59th PLA Group Army, as its 2 armored battalions, 1 apiece, were sent to both secure I-35W in Burleson, as well as also partaking in the combat that was unfolding now in downtown Dallas, as the air assault troops were, of course, the first on the scene. In the east of the city, as it pertained to the entire metroplex, PLA combat engineers of the 40th Combat Engineer Brigade were also engaged now in massive combat operations as they were storming a portion of the city which had been hit heavily by 300mm rocket artillery descending upon it, shaping the battlefield in order for these combat engineers to go in and mop up all remaining resistance, as they would move in with their specialized engineering vehicles, as well as also their armor personnel carriers and infantry fighting vehicles, as well as also their combat robots, as these 12.7mm heavy machine gun equipped quad-legged robots made these PLA combat engineers a very well-equipped and very technologically advanced force, as there were also FPV drone operators within these combat engineer battalions, and of course their headquarters and support company also had its own dedicated combat drone section, which operated the CH-901A loitering munitions, as these forces hurriedly moved in to clear the flanks of any and all resistance. Major objectives were being captured as these flank clearance operations were being conducted in order to make these actions much more rapid and much more efficient by clearing out any obstacles that would lay in the way of the units tasked with seizing the key objectives, which again included the DFW International Airport, also the downtowns of both Dallas and Fort Worth, as well as also the absolute and total destruction of the Naval Air Station on Lake Worth in Fort Worth in White Settlement, a suburb of Fort Worth in the northwest of the city along I-820, as the highly advanced Type 96B main battle tanks of the 35th Armored Brigade, having had committed a single battalion to this action, rolled in. They pummeled not only the American Armored Forces of a tank company guarding the east-facing side of the facility, but also rained down 125mm tank shells and ATGMs alongside of heavy artillery, missile, and airstrikes. Even a strategic air raid utilizing one of 3 H-6K heavy strategic bomber aircraft, which completely and utterly leveled the Lockheed Martin plant and the Shorad Battalion, the first of the 124th with it, into absolute total ashes, as light infantry forces also were partaking in the actions in the Fort Worth area of the 24th Light Infantry Brigade. They, too, assisted not only in clearing the flanks, but also directly assaulting the Naval Air Station in tandem with the Armored Battalion moving in from the 35th Armored Brigade, who also had committed 3 additional armored battalions to the main assault occurring at the DFW International Airport, with their final armored battalion being committed against a large grouping of armed reactionary civilians directly to the north near Gainesville. As to the immediate east of the city of Arlington, a large additional flank clearance operation was occurring within the city of Grand Prairie, which was built on very hilly terrain, to say the least, as the terrain shifted from low-lying terrain in the Dallas area in the south of Dallas and Lancaster, which is immediately adjacent to the south of Dallas, all the way up to Arlington, where the terrain was much higher, as the highway, I-20, had to pass through this terrain. The highway was exceedingly useful as a means for troop transit and logistical resupply operations, and thus the flank clearance operation served several purposes, one being the destruction of all resistance, the second being the capture of I-820 in Grand Prairie, and the third being the absolute and total annihilation of the Taylor Army Heliport, which was a Army and Air National Guard facility, as well as a reserve facility, which even included a Marine Corps Reserve Artillery unit, the 2nd of the 14th, a Marine Corps battalion of HIMARS, which was actually their very first HIMARS battalion for the Marine Corps. As all of this combat was unfolding throughout the entire Metroplex, the fighting going on in Arlington took place in 2 major pockets. As we go to the map of the entire Metroplex, the flank clearance operations, much like those in Grand Prairie, were being carried out by mechanized infantry battalions moving in to effectively clear this portion of the city and secure their segment of I-20, as it pertained to battalions belonging to the 16th Infantry Division of the PLA's 59th Group Army, as the Artillery Battalion of the 16th ID was heavily involved in assaulting the Taylor Army Heliport immediately at midnight, followed by assisting in a kill box that had been created by 2 mechanized infantry battalions striking deep into Grand Prairie, with one of 2 battalions carrying out a cordon action on 3 sides, with airstrikes coming in from very powerful JH-7 strike aircraft, along with the artillery strikes from the 16th Artillery, which consisted of the PLZ-05 self-propelled howitzers. The airstrikes were likewise exceedingly formidable and destructive against enemy forces, as even 2 of these aircraft carried nearly 40,000 pounds of air-to-ground ordnance, as each aircraft could carry nearly 20,000 square pounds of such weapons. These air-to-ground strike aircraft played an immense role in the absolute and total devastation of defending forces, as in the Arlington area of the city in the south of the Metroplex, 4 mechanized infantry battalions were committed to the action in this area, with one moving in to seize the segment of I-20 from the south, while 3 others moved in to directly engage armed reactionary civilian elements as they began materializing within mere minutes of the grid and comms down situation from the tandem anti-satellite strikes and cyber strikes, along with as well the onbooting of very powerful ground-based electronic warfare assets from the 59th PLA Group Army's Electronic Warfare Regiment, in addition to those carried aboard the JH-7 strike aircraft, also known as the Flying Leopards, as well as the H-6K heavy strategic bomber aircraft, both of which carried the KG-600 electromagnetic jamming pods, which were state-of-the-industry, state-of-the-art electronic warfare weapons, which could pinpoint the origin of enemy radio or radar signals and jam them accordingly with directed electromagnetic jamming. As these very potent capabilities were all in play by this point, communications between forces on the ground had completely broken down in terms of distance communications, as these forces of the defending side could only communicate through very short-range eye-shot or earshot, or line of sight and earshot communications, and also using runners, which was an exceedingly dangerous job in order to coordinate forces that were spread over slightly longer distances, as these runners had to brave all the different hazards that were now unfolding throughout this massive urban battlefield, as many thousands of armed reactionary civilians had arisen throughout the entire metroplex. All of these were considered minor threats by the PLA forces, as the PLA completely understood that these were effectively armed mobs that were leaderless and lacked central command, as well as also working logistical networks and systems, as well as also cohesiveness and coordination, and thus they proved to be a very little threat against the heavily armored phalanxes of the PLA forces, as well as also their immense air and missile capabilities brought to bear on this battlefield, as also even the light artillery forces contained within each mechanized infantry battalion, such as their fire support company, consisting of 2 firing platoons of their very capable and robust 130mm Type 63 systems, as well as also their self-propelled dual-purpose assault gun / mortars, PLL-05s, as they had 1 platoon of these in their fire support companies, in addition to the 2 firing platoons of the Type 63s, were more than a match for the forces on the ground and brought enormous devastation to the battlefield, in conjunction with the even heavier weapons that were also in play at this time. As we go to the map, as the fighting in Arlington unfolded within 30 minutes of the entire nationwide invasion breaking out, as the fighting occurring in the southernmost end of Grand Prairie had broken out within the first 20 minutes, these forces, leaving their CCP regime properties purchased by the CCP regime as close as possible to their given objectives, were now fully mobilized and racing off their properties at the stroke of midnight, as they had all conducted their pre-maintenance services and checks on their vehicles. They had all ensured that their logistics were properly prepared for their operations, and were also in single file ready to leave these properties at the time of the invasion at midnight, as these forces hurried against these emerging threats, as they had planned for this type of operation for some time. They knew where the vast majority of armed American civilians were concentrated within the city, as they had many different types of records, including purchase records that they had acquired from various armament stores and other like shops offline, as their cyber warfare arm was able to ascertain vital intelligence on these types of activities, such as sales of firearms based on this stolen, hacked information, and thus they were able to incorporate it into their planning for their total nationwide invasion, utilizing their real-time AI battlefield data processing system, along with the cooperation of the PLA's intelligence arm, using this very powerful AI-based system to aid them in tailoring their specific battle plans all the way down to the tactical level on the ground. As these forces raced in against the emerging materializing armed reactionary civilians that had to cluster up close together due to lack of communications, they presented themselves effectively out in the open as massive targets and were thus going to be dealt with accordingly by the Mechanized Infantry Battalions of the 16th ID. This battalion would effectively be held in reserve as they would secure the interstate, but if needed, they could be called forward, although this would not be necessary. These 3 battalions moving into Arlington would be more than sufficient for the operation as it broke out, as the artillery was mostly at first concentrated on the Taylor Army heliport before diverting its operations to other areas such as the kill box that had developed in the south of Grand Prairie, as well as also hitting American elements in Arlington. This would largely unfold within 45 minutes of the operation occurring, as it took 30 minutes to get into their specific areas of operation. These battalions were now hurriedly moving into place and beginning to assault their enemies accordingly, as the area of Arlington in the east, where a large grouping of armed reactionary civilians, approximately 300 or so, had emerged, a surrounding operation would take place whereby 4 PLA Mechanized Infantry companies would effectively swing in from the east, moving west, while the other 2 out of 6 of this battalion would swing around and effectively block off all escape, and airstrikes and artillery strikes, as well as also the strikes coming in from their own fire support company, would be immense, as well as also loitering munition strikes as well, as these were prevalent over the entire metro area, as each and every battalion effectively had their own combat drone section, which could fire enormous salvos of these loitering munitions into the sky, effectively 48 per battalion, as the entire metroplex was effectively blotted out by these loitering munitions overhead. There was not a single part of the sky where at least one couldn't be seen at all times. As this particular action occurs along I-30 in this particular area, this is effectively, again, 300 armed reactionary civilians being assaulted by 1 mechanized infantry battalion, with heavy artillery support by 45 minutes in, as well as also close air support from JH-7 strike aircraft, as the JH-7s were, again, a massively heavy-hitting aircraft against enemy forces, as well as also a pair of J-11 fighter aircraft from the J-11 squadron conducting combat air patrols overhead very early in the operation, as they, a pair here, are flying over this particular area, which is a 1.5 mile by 1 mile area, and approximately 5 miles to the west was the Cowboys Stadium, which in fact was not located in the city of Dallas, but was actually located in the city of Arlington, where the Dallas Cowboys' new stadium had been constructed. This was a massive stadium for football and encompassed a large area of massive parking lots, as well as also adjacent apartment complexes and rail lines for a freight rail that ran through this area. As in this particular area, there are some shops to the immediate south of the football stadium complex, and there is a large drainage ditch that runs between the parking areas and the freight rail line and other areas beyond. These are apartment complexes, one having a pool and a pool house in this area, wherein PLA snipers and spotter teams would effectively set up on the rooftops of freshly cleared apartment buildings and would utilize these positions to great effect to support their troops as they moved in to surround this entire area filled with a massive number of armed reactionary civilians, as there was a total of 800 of them occupying the stadium alone, with others trying to hurriedly enter in and others trapped in the parking area and thus would be destroyed by the combination of loitering munition strikes, air strikes from JH-7s, heavy mortar strikes from 120mm mortar fire coming from their dual-purpose assault gun/mortar systems, the PLL-05s, as well as also rocket strikes coming in from the 130mm Type 63 firing platoons, 2 in each battalion's fire support company, with a single platoon of the PLL-05 heavy assault gun/mortars. This was the stadium area being rapidly surrounded by a single battalion of mechanized infantry forces, as this, again, was not a massive area by any means, but it was a relatively large area spanning 1 mile by 1 kilometer. And within this area, again, sat the stadium surrounded by its enormous parking lots, apartment complexes, which were both immediately to the east of the stadium, but also to the west as well, again with shops located to the south and commercial areas effectively. As these different mechanized infantry companies moved into the area, they kept their headquarters platoons nearby, which effectively encapsulated their command and logistical elements per each combat company of mechanized infantry, as this company's headquarters platoon is in this position as they put their vehicles in a star formation as a protective formation to protect their lighter skinned vehicles, such as their supply and logistical trucks, their armored ambulance, their fuel truck, their armored recovery vehicle, and of course the commander's vehicle as well, per each company, as the same was being done in these 2 platoons here, headquarters platoons of this company and this company. This was effectively a 3-company operation out of the entire battalion, as they had 3 additional mechanized infantry companies, their actual headquarters and support company, which was the command over the entire battalion, and the chief logistical forces of the whole battalion, which distributed logistics to the headquarters platoons of each company. And there was also the fire support company that was off in the distance some 4 miles away, as the range of the fire support company's light artillery elements was such to where the light artillery rockets, the 130mm multiple launch Type 63 systems, had a 5-mile range, with the PLL-05 dual-purpose heavy assault gun/mortar system having a 5.5-mile range. So 4 miles away, they were still well within range to hit these targets. So on the larger map, they would have been further back, 4 miles away toward I-20, along with their headquarters and support company, with the 3 additional mechanized infantry companies held back to effectively guard their flanks of their headquarters company and support company. As in this particular area, the combat unfolding here was occurring at exactly the same time as the combat was unfolding further east, in the east of Arlington. As in this particular area here, there's a church, there are some stores, there are some more commercial sites, there are apartment buildings, like so, whole complexes, and effectively residential neighborhoods and more commercial areas, a gas station, more apartment complexes. This was effectively a mixed commercial and residential area in the east of Arlington that was now under heavy assault, as again, 2 mechanized infantry companies were surrounding the area from the west, while 4 others were effectively coming in from the east to surround 300 armed reactionary civilians, destroying many of them on the push to surround the rest. As in this area, they are clearing their flanks by using dismounted mechanized infantry squads that are moving through the area, effectively clearing the outsides of these neighborhoods and apartment complexes to ensure that there is no resistance. they will only effectively go through and conduct thorough building clearance operations a bit later after they have officially destroyed the major threats that were discovered outdoors by their massive surveillance apparatus, which consisted of their quadcopter squad and vehicle crew level assets, all the way up to their high altitude drone assets, all the way to satellite at the very top, all overlaying to create a real-time, three-dimensional, ever-changing look at the modern fluid battlefield, steadily updating friendly and foe positions as foes were discovered or enemies, and also updating friendly positions as the squads and vehicles that had their combat data links in the vehicles acted as transponders for the rough locations of squads and the exact locations of vehicles based on the squad NCO and based on the vehicle positions. As these were steadily updated, the massive surveillance apparatus from the squad all the way to high altitude, all the way to satellite could effectively see everything as it unfolded in the entire metroplex. It was effectively a ubiquitous see everything surveillance apparatus, and the fighting in these neighborhoods would effectively consist of dismount on dismount combat as the flanks were being cleared to the north, while the vehicle-based forces of 4 companies were pushing the main body of the armed reactionary civilians into a devastating pocket where they would be relentlessly shelled and also strafed and hit from the air by airstrikes, as these JH-7s could also strafe ground targets with their twin 23mm nose cannons, which were completely devastating. As in this particular area, there are a number of different movements all occurring at about the same time, as both the PLA and the Armed Reactionary Civilian Forces were on the move as soon as this map opens up, and leading up to it, as of course, it took them 30 minutes as it pertained to the PLA Mechanized Infantry to arrive on scene, as they were guided into place by the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, directing them on exactly where to move based on enemy discoveries. As they found pockets of resistors, these forces were guided in all of their maneuvers and even their squads into place based on where enemy activity had been sighted by the ISR surveillance apparatus. As artillery strikes and airstrikes, and even the AI target-seeking mode on the loitering munitions, as these were equipped with HE munitions fired by this battalion's headquarters and support company's combat drone section from their TEL-based 48-tube system. These, combined with the heavy 120mm mortars and 130mm rocket strikes, would conduct a variety of different fire missions and strike operations, as everything from terrain denial strikes to pinpoint precision strikes to a mass barrage, which would unfold as these forces were pushed into a pocket, would all occur and be absolutely destructive beyond all imagination. As now, the forces moving through these neighborhoods and apartment complexes were all completely and totally seen as these different PLA squads are moving in their various tactical formations. Some are moving in rolling shield formations, others in line formations, others in staggered formations, others in rolling T's so that the men on the end can watch the tops and higher levels of taller buildings, some in double column formations, and wedge formations. As all these different tactical formations play a key role in how these operations unfold based on their guidance received by the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, depending on where enemy activity was seen and where exactly it was seen, if on top of roofs, inside of buildings, or outside of buildings, and also where these forces were generally moving, as again they had to congregate in large groups due to the lack of communications capabilities, as well as also even ISR capabilities, meaning that These armed reactionary civilians did not even know that they were even being surrounded. How could they know? They had no means of surveilling the battlefield for themselves and seeing where exactly these forces were moving at against them in order to surround them. The same was the case in this area, although by the time these three companies had arrived on scene and were beginning to conduct their maneuvering, which effectively had full interlocking fields of fire through this parking area and also direct fire at the complex, the personnel inside already had an idea that they were being surrounded because this was a smaller area and they could see out into the parking area. And the airstrikes that occurred on this grouping right here were particularly hellacious, as 8,000 pounds of air-to-ground ordnance had been dropped as this JH-7 went into a dive attack, as these were free-fall munitions and they pounded a relatively large area and had a wide spread as they were free-fall munitions conducted in a dive attack, which gave the dive attack accuracy, but also a good spread as well of hitting a larger target area, as also laser-guided precision munitions or even satellite-guided by munitions could be used. These aircraft often opted for the free-fall munitions due to what the mission called for, as it was fully anticipated that they would be encountering large groups of resistors like so, as well as also heavy mortar strikes coming in and more. As all of this was taking place very early into the invasion, the forces on the defending side were effectively caught completely with their pants down, as they had no time whatsoever at all to even react effectively to what was already going on. They had no anti-tank weapons with which to take on armored vehicles. These armored vehicles came together and worked in teams. They did not come alone, so sneaking up on them was effectively out of the question for the most part, as they had staggered weapons and their gunners scanned their sectors of fire, preventing any type of attack with short-ranged weapons like Molotovs from coming up against them. They also had immense support from loitering munitions, heavy assault gun mortar systems like the PLA 5, also rocket attacks from 130mm rocket strikes, and, if needed, artillery. But in this particular instance, they also had support from dedicated combat drones like these Wing Loon 2s with their HJ-10 anti-tank guided missiles, which were a very long-range and powerful ATGM, as well as also CM-502KGs, which were a dual-purpose anti-tank, anti-ship missile, which had the penetration capabilities to penetrate battleship armor, which was very impressive for this type of weapon system, and it could be fired from a drone like the Wing Loon 2, as this building, with approximately 15 personnel inside and others outside, are about to get heavily pounded by CM-502KG fire to clear the flank on this company element as it moves through this parking area. Again, loitering munitions with HE warheads were also patrolling the area as well on AI target-seeking mode, looking for targets like so in this drainage ditch. As these personnel are trying to sneak through the drainage ditch, they've been discovered and would be destroyed. Also, the heavy machine gunner on the MRAP, such as this Tiger MRAP on this corner here, would fire down into the ditch. And although they had relatively good cover moving through this ditch, they were not immune from these strikes, including also heavy machine gun fire if they got on the wrong side of the ditch and could be seen at that type of angle. As this technical was moving up the street, it was heavily peppered by 12.7mm heavy machine gun fire from this MRAP and this headquarters platoon, destroying it completely, as there was also a grouping of 30 personnel running through this area. They too would be engaged by heavy machine gun fire, as well as loitering munition strikes. This group here as well, upon coming up to the corner of this apartment complex and looking through, could see these personnel, which would open fire at them, as this red indicates here, and they would opt to flee but be hit by a loitering munition strike, as other personnel off-map are being fired at by this Wing Loon 2 with HJ-10 ATGMs, having fired them from further away. It's just following through with its shots. These would also hit defending personnel a bit further away. The sniper spotter teams coming from the headquarters and support company of the entire battalion would be instrumental in assisting this element of 3 of their companies, their combat companies, with this operation, as the sniper spotter teams would be able to fire from their high positions on these buildings over this wall into the main compound where there were personnel, as they could also be seen by the quadcopter, vehicle-based, and squad-based assets. So precision strikes from heavy assault gun mortars could be called on them, as well as rocket strikes. Although artillery had not been ordered for this operation, it was available. As these forces, very few would make it into the building alive. Many of them would be hit as they ran through this area by heavy assault gun mortar strikes, as this combat company begins to dismount its squads. They begin to move in to seize this building, as this was actually a major objective, not to the scale that the International Airport was, or the Meacham Airport, or even Love Field, or the downtowns of Dallas and Fort Worth. However, it was seen as an important site for everything from prisoners of war to being used as a combat outpost, as this was a walled-in site with a relatively secured open area, which was the football field, which could be used for all sorts of military-related activities. As a result, as these forces are moving amid all the different cars that were left in the parking lot, although there weren't many at this time because the games had not been going on recently, they were engaged by the lead IFV had destroyed these technicals with personnel inside. There were about 5 to 7 in each of these technicals. This ZBD-04A used its 30mm autocannon to simply blast them into complete scrap metal, as also loitering munitions hit them at the same time. This grouping was also targeted by 3 loitering munitions with HE warheads and fired at the same time by this dismounting squad on the very end coming from the IFV. As the heavy machine gunners could possibly fire over their troops, they were guided on when to do so by the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, which cut down enormously on friendly fire casualties as it guided the forces on what weapons were safe to use and when and how, including angle and traverse of weapons, which would keep their own forces safe while economizing and maximizing the destruction on the defending forces. As all these squads of this lead platoon were moving in from the western entrance, the follow-up platoon was moving in to the northern entrance, while the third and last combat platoon, not counting the headquarters platoon, which was the logistic and command elements, were moving in through this area, as they, upon moving in, had their heavy machine gunners shred these technicals to pieces, destroying them and everybody inside. By the time they dismounted, they had a small fight with personnel exiting the facility, while others that were trying to run in were firing back. But the interlocking fields of fire, as well as also heavy fire support from their heavy weapons when possible, completely annihilated these 2 groupings of armed reactionary civilians, except for these 5 that managed to get in through the northern entrance before these forces had made it to the entrance as well. And as green is on the tips of these arrows, that means that as they breach this facility, they're taking heavy fire, but as well as dishing it out, including entering through this side, and this platoon here entering through these entrances on the east and northeast side. As these very few personnel made it inside, these personnel and their technicals were all annihilated by loitering munition and heavy assault gun mortar strikes. Mortar strike here annihilated these personnel, with very few making it in alive. There were also sniper shots that were ringing out and eliminating some personnel, like this personnel right here and these 2 right here, as this group tried to take on this last platoon, although the heavy machine gun fire and fire from these squads wiped them all out. Sniper fire also got these personnel. The sniper spotter teams were quite helpful in the overall operation, although they played a relatively minor role compared to the vehicle-based firepower, the fire support company's firepower, and the combat drones and loitering munitions that were being utilized in this operation, as rocket strikes like so were also a common sight in the fighting that was breaking out in not only Grand Prairie, but also here in Arlington and other parts of the city. Many armed reactionary civilian groups and their technicals were absolutely shred to pieces by these enormous rocket strikes, which were absolutely, undeniably, hellaciously devastating as these salvos of rockets, and even the PLL-05 dual-purpose assault gun mortars, caused extensive destruction throughout the battle space as the mechanized infantry forces moved in to their areas of operations. They brought with them not only the heavy firepower of their vehicles, such as their heavy machine gun equipped Type 89As, or their very powerful ZBD-04As equipped with a 100mm main gun, 30mm autocannon, 7.62 by 54mm coax, and even 2 ATGM pods for HJ09 ATGMs. These forces brought with them man-portable ATGMs, such as the HJ08s. They also had light anti-armor and anti-personnel weaponry, such as the Type 69-1s or the Type 69 rocket-propelled Chinese RPGs. These were also very effective, especially when fighting light dismount forces, such as these armed reactionary civilians, as they had both an anti-armor and an anti-personnel round, which is a fragmentation round, which could cause massive damage to clustered groupings of dismounted forces, as they also had a light machine gunner in each and every squad with a QBJ-201, which had a very high rate of fire, as well as their QBZ-95 standard rifles, some equipped with a 35mm grenade tube. These dismounted squads had immense amounts of firepower at their disposal. And of course, again, this was not counting all their support they received from their own fire support company, also loitering munitions from their headquarters and support company, heavy artillery, and airstrikes, even in some cases, cruise and tactical ballistic missile fire, in addition to everything else. Also combat drones, when available, such as Wingloom 2s and even more advanced Wingloom models. As the heavy fighting ensued, the city of Arlington, like much of the Metroplex, became a complete and total war zone, a hellscape of absolute and total annihilation, as the firepower brought to bear against the defending forces was simply of a nature that most could not have anticipated, as the invasion forces were simply massive, and as they concentrated in specific areas at the very opening of the invasion, they frequently outnumbered the defending forces, and these crossfire exchanges that unfolded in these areas often resulted in enormous non-combatant casualties as well. Oftentimes many more than what the combatant casualties were in terms of the defending American side. Their non-combatant casualties were often many times higher, not only as a result of the crossfire, but also strikes coming in from the fire support companies of mechanized infantry battalions, also the HJ-10 strikes from the anti-tank companies and the armored battalions, or also heavy artillery and air strikes, such as artillery like the self-propelled PLZ-01 or PLZ-05 rather 155mm self-propelled howitzers, as well as also the artillery forces of the 19th Artillery Brigade, which had even heavier weapons such as their PHL-03 battalion rather, and also their 122mm Type 83 multiple launch rocket systems, which again were an upgrade on the PHL-81 family of 122mm multiple launch rocket systems, as well as also towed and very powerful howitzers, such as the PLL-01 155mm howitzers and the PLL-66 152mm howitzers, as they had 2 battalions of each howitzer type. All of this firepower and the air power brought to bear, such as the infamous JH-7 Flying Leopards, were simply monumental in terms of their capabilities and destruction. As also, there were heavy strategic bomber aircraft partaking in this operation. They would be used, in some instances, in a tactical way where they would actually hit specific enemy units, but for the most part, they would conduct strategic air raids on key industrial and other sites throughout the metroplexes. This was a massive area of 8 million inhabitants where some of America's limited numbers of industrial war production capacity were located, which included aviation companies, especially one being the Lockheed Martin plant that was hit early on by a combo of tactical ballistic missile strikes, also an H-6K heavy strategic bomber raid, and more, including artillery. As all of this was now underway, the fighting that occurred in Arlington will be covered in the next video installation of this hypothetical invasion documentary series highlighting fourth-generation warfare doctrines, utilizing it through the guise of a Sino-Russian coalition invasion of America. More to come in the next video installation.